I've been meaning to make a little bit more content. Uh, right now, I mean, my channel is mostly lectures that I have that I had to upload because of COVID. I was just trying to upload stuff that's accessible to my students and accessible via multiple platforms and all that kind of stuff. There's other places where a professor might find good company on YouTube. Maybe one of those is BookTube. I don't know if I'll join. I don't know if I have the time or really the desire to do a lot of book reviews, but I do often get questions about science fiction or kind of like the stuff that I like to read. And there was a recent tag on BookTube that I found by watching a channel that I watch sometimes called Plagued by Visions. He's excellent. He does a lot of reviews on weird literature, Spanish language literature, all sorts of stuff. So I liked Plagued by Visions. I generally enjoy the list that he comes up with. And he got that by someone named Michael K. Vaughan. And so I just want to go through these questions because I think it's like a more interesting format to talk about science fiction than just talking about, books or whatever themselves. It kind of runs the gamut and it tells a little bit of a story. So the first question that they asked is, what was the first science fiction book that you read, and what did you think of it? I hope there aren't any typos in the questions. If there are, it's my fault, not theirs, obviously. And when I was like a kid, I can't remember reading too much fiction, to be perfectly honest. But I do remember being obsessed with Zoobooks, which were like these magazines that we had in our elementary school that would go over like various types of cats. I remember reading as many of those as I could as possible. Part of that was we had this program called Accelerated Reader, where you got points for reading books and taking these online quizzes. And if you took enough of them, you could get these little like vouchers for a free personal pan pizza at Pizza Hut. I absolutely loved that idea. And so I read Zoo books because they were short, but I also just like really like science. And so that was probably like the first, it's not science fiction, right? But it is sci fi. And related to that, there were these like, I couldn't remember the titles of them, but there were these books on like the Loch Ness Monster and UFOs and Bigfoot and all that kind of stuff. I loved that. So that was the kind of stuff that I started out reading. But the one like science fiction book that I for sure can remember is this book called The Wonderful Flight to the Mushroom Planet. And I don't remember too much about the details. I don't even know that this is the exact cover that my elementary school library had. But I do remember just like reading this book and thinking about flying in a rocket and stuff like that. Now, I will say, I tried to read other things, like The Fellowship of the Rings or whatever else, but one of the things that confused me when I was a kid, and maybe I'm stupid to admit this, was like I didn't understand what world they were talking about. I didn't get that fiction, like they would talk about these or fantasy, like they would talk about these fictional worlds as if they were real and in like real detail. And so I was like, wait, where is this country? Middle Earth? I don't know where you're talking about, right? Um, and so like I had to age, I guess, a little bit more into into reading fantasy and stuff like that, which I read today. But that was like one of the first hurdles. But yeah, this book, yeah. Next question: what was the last science fiction book you read, and what did you think of it? Now this was kind of tough for me because I have been reading kind of like a lot of fiction because it's just the beginning of the spring semester here, spring 2022. And this break, I was like completely burned out from the last couple years of teaching during COVID. So I spent a lot of time listening to audiobooks and reading and stuff like that. And I did read some really, really great books. I read Ring Shout, which was really incredible. It's sort of like an alternative history horror novel about these women who hunt the KKK. It's because the KKK is turning into literal monsters. Highly recommend that book. Go read Ring Shout. It's short. It's really good. It's written very, very well. Incredible plot and pacing. It's not, yeah, good book. I also recently read The Ballad of Black Tom, which is kind of like this Lovecraftian book. And it just takes the premise. What kind of story might Lovecraft write if he weren't such a raging racist? Um, So it's like an interesting book about this guy who lives in New York. He's a black man, so he has to deal with racism. But then he meets this, older white man who has a proposition for him, and it just kind of changes things. And it's like basically a meditation on how you would interact with the world if the world were full of people that constantly hurt you, and the world was very painful. How would you relate to the elder gods in the Cthulhu mythos? So I think those are like the two most recent, really strong things that I've read. But I wouldn't call either of those science fiction, right? Definitely in speculative fiction, fantasy, horror, alt history kind of stuff, but not science fiction. One second. I gotta turn off my heater because it's gonna be like really loud if I don't. In fact, it might kick on for a little bit. And I just record these in one take because I don't want to have the time or spend the time of editing the video. So I apologize to you if you start to hear the noise. But yeah, so I had to think like pretty far back, what was the last science fiction book that I read? And I think it was probably Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. And it's not that I haven't read it. I remember reading it in high school, and I've read it, a few times since. And the last, few years, I've really tried to try and read it maybe once a year. And when I say read stuff, I don't always mean to read it in paper, although I have the paper, right? This is the Norton Critical Edition. If you all haven't ever seen Norton Critical Editions, what's great about these is that they have the work, but then they also have lots of critical essays and stuff on top of that. So usually I'll listen to audiobooks whenever I'm walking my dog. And I think Frankenstein was probably the last thing that I read. Sometimes I don't like it as much as I think maybe I should, because like the old timey prose where it just doesn't really do much. It can get a little too flowery and be a little too slow for me at times. But when Mary Shelley gets it right, she gets it right, and I really love it. And the story itself, I mean, is just incredible. It's has a ton of allegorical features, right? But it's basically a story about someone who's been created, and having been created, they're thrust into this world, I think with lots of hopes. But the world doesn't treat them well. And so they find nothing but pain and social ostracism and stuff like that. And every time that they reach out to people to do the right thing, not only are they disappointed, they're treated poorly, and that takes its toll, right? It's a very sympathetic portrayal of the creature, aka the monster, right? And Victor Frankenstein is just like the doctor, the guy who makes the monster, is like a complete jerk. He's a chud. So this book, I think it rewards multiple readings, and this was probably the last thing that I read because I usually get in the mood to read it or listen to it sometime in the fall. I really love horror. I really love fall and Halloween and Day of the Dead, and usually around that time of year, Frankenstein is one of the books that I pull out. Okay, next question. If you love science fiction, what made you love science fiction? Now, this is a complicated question. I was in school for a long time. In high school, I was like intensely involved. I played athletics. I did like theater and competitive academic stuff. Although our academic teams weren't all that great when I was in high school. But I did a lot of things. I grew up in a small town, which means you kind of have to do a lot of things because there aren't that many students to field the team. So I did a lot of stuff. I did a lot of volunteering. Loved hanging out with my friends. So I came to leisurely reading probably pretty late in life, actually. I did a little bit of it in college. But for the most part, the first time in my life that I can really remember loving reading was after I had graduated my master's and when I was spending a year in Germany as a Fulbright. For the first time in a really long time, maybe ever in my life, I just had free time. Now, I had to be like a teaching assistant in Germany, and I attended university classes at Ruhr Uni, Ruhr Uni in Bochum. It was good. It was really good. But that left me with some time. And so I read a bunch of stuff. I remember reading Moby Dick. I remember reading a ton of science fiction short stories. And I think like in my mid 20s was the first time that I had an opportunity to just relax and read without a deadline and take stuff in because I wanted to read it. And so since then, I've been like more conscious or conscientious of the reasons that I read the things that I read. And I think I've come up with some ideas that for me have rung true about the past decade of my life. For me, the best fiction, kind of like the first few points, are avoiding the Scylla and the Charybdis, which are two mythical monsters, right? You have one on one side and one on the other. And the goal is to navigate between them. This is a reference to Greek mythology. And I think that one monster is what I often find in people like literary fiction, right? And so within science fiction, these are people like Kazuo Ishiguro. I think he's a good example. I think even someone like George Orwell is like this, where they have really, really beautiful style, right? But they write about mundane reality for the most part, and I couldn't care less about any of the events. I just get bogged down. I think it's really boring. I don't care about these people or their lives. It just doesn't make for interesting reading to me. So style or like, psychological insights or whatever else, it's not good enough. It's not good enough. Drama I think is really cheap. I think it's really easy to do. If I want to read about, gut-wrenching stories, I'll just read history, as I often do. I study, kind of the philosophy of race. A lot of that deals with really horrible things that humans have done. I don't need to turn to literature to be reminded of all that awful stuff. I want there to be a little bit of hope. And I think literary fiction, even though it can be written really, really well, often is portraying things that I just don't care about, or the drama I find very cheap and I feel like manipulated in a bad way. It feels Oscar baity, right? I don't like it. But on the other hand, I've read a lot of genre fiction, aka speculative fiction, in science fiction and horror and fantasy that I just really don't like. The recent book that comes to mind is a book. It was like a vampire book, Certain Dark Things, and I thought it was written really badly. It was full of like cliched words. The style of the writing didn't really make sense, and the plot ended up really being like not that great. But whenever we're thinking about genre fiction or speculative fiction, I think more often than not, I will give it much more slack because I really do like the outlandish premises, these philosophical thought experiments about what would happen if the world were different in a particular way, right? What happens if we had technology that could connect our minds to an alternate reality? What happens if we had a pill that offered, the perfect hedonistic getaway? Any number of science fiction premises. What happens if we could alter ourselves to where we don't need sleep? There's a lot of great premises in science fiction, right? I love that. I love that. But even the best premises cannot make up for really bad writing. So for me, the people who are the best at writing are the ones who are able to balance, respecting the craft and understanding how to write and understanding the deep psychology of characters without just like being really overt about stuff. And people who also understand that stories need to have some sort of plot. They need to be saying something interesting, right? And so like I think it's really hard to do both of those things. And the best fiction I think finds a way to avoid the two problems that I just talked about. And so generally, I guess in a positive sense, now that I've talked about the negatives, I want at least one character that I can root for. This is something that Vonnegut talks about whenever he's addressing how you should write literature. I don't really like Vonnegut that much, actually, but I think that he's dead on when he says you do have to give the reader at least one character that you can root for. Often in literary fiction and a bunch of other fiction, it's just kind of like I don't really care too much about the characters, man. And if you don't give me one, I'm just like not gonna have any motivation to finish the book. The second thing that I'm saying is like you need some sort of like, for me, philosophical point without writing philosophy. Again, if I want to like actually think through arguments, and think through things in the abstract, I'll go read philosophy. I'm a philosopher. I have a PhD in philosophy. I can read philosophy of technology and bioethics and all that kind of stuff like I usually do. What I want in fiction is for someone to have an understanding of the basics of those ideas, but for it to come out in the dialogue or in the action, not in just these like soliloquies or in these like just really self-important ways, which is related to the last point. And it's I find that I really want an author who is sensitive to characters and to psychology without just being self-important. A lot of literary types and artistic types can just be really pretentious. They can have their heads up their own asses, basically, and fall really in love with going on these rants or whatever. I hate that. I really hate that. Because often, and maybe this is messed up for me to say, they aren't that good at thinking through things because they haven't taken the time to really read a lot or think about stuff. Now, there are exceptions, right? There are really good exceptions of people who are good at writing essays and getting to the point, and I don't feel like they're wasting my time. But very often, I think a lot of literary writers, I feel like they are wasting my time. And I really don't like that. So good fiction remembers the story first and foremost and makes the reading experience, I think, enjoyable to the audience. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't like gruesome stuff or gut-wrenching stuff, but I want there to be a little bit of redemption. I want there to be hope, or I want there to be characters that I love, that who go through things. I don't want to be crushed at the very end, and I don't want to be beaten over the head by ideas. So science fiction, the whole point of this video, is a genre that I feel like can really do that. And the first time I remember really seeing that was when one of my best friends, Shoutout Thomas, from university, he told me about, well, actually he told my girlfriend at the time about this particular author. And he said, you might like her too. And so I checked her out, and I fell in love with science fiction because of Ursula K Le Guin. She's going to return on this little video. But Ursula K Le Guin is someone who I think does all of the things that I've just talked about. She has a very elegant and straightforward prose style. She takes ideas of gender and race and politics and cultures incredibly seriously. She has a social justice bent, but she never rubs your nose in it. She's someone who never forgets the story. Now, there are works that I'm more and less fond of, and I know that there are like criticisms of some of her stuff. But for the most part, especially in her short stories, I feel like she gets it. She just gets it. And she might be, for me, the best science fiction writer of all time. And in fact, it's January 23rd right now. I think she died January 22nd, 2018. So, we're already approaching 4 years. And I don't really, I'm usually not affected by celebrity deaths or anything like that. But I remember really reflecting on Ursula K Le Guin's death, because for me, she was kind of like one of these authors who rescued science fiction and fantasy and speculative fiction from a lot of like macho bullshit and really simplistic characters and really lazy tropes. She understood science and other cultures and languages. She was kind of a linguist. She spoke multiple languages, but she never forgot that she was a writer, first and foremost, and that people had to read the stuff that she read. I always felt respected I always feel respected whenever I read her stuff. And one thing that really I will never forget about Le Guin is that as she got older and as she got more notoriety, she never lost sight that a fundamental part of life is to take care of vulnerable people. And she used her wit and her platform to try and hold publishing and writing accountable, and to try and get us to imagine new ways of living in the world. And I think that, I didn't put it on this slide, but I think one thing about science fiction is that it helps you to think about what the world would be like if stuff were better. Dystopian fiction is fun, okay? And I think it can be somewhat affirming whenever we're feeling down. We know that we can get through really tough stuff. But I think dystopian thinking just in a really dramatic way, that can be very, very lazy. Because it's easy to find problems in society. And Look, I'm a philosopher. I think that art can often serve really important political functions. But if you just stay at that critical level and never try to envision anything better, I think it's not as intellectually diligent or intellectually useful or socially useful or emotionally useful. One of the things that I really don't like, for example, about some of Octavia Butler's books or even Cormac McCarthy is that sometimes they're just really bleak. And that's never been my experience of human life. Maybe it's because I'm American, but humans adapt to things and humans experience joy and really wonderful things a lot of times. And if it's just outright bleakness, I don't buy it. It doesn't seem credible to me. It's another reason I don't really like George Orwell's 1984. I just don't find it very plausible. The writing is gorgeous. I really just don't like it because I feel like it's too bleak. Bleak in the sense that it doesn't make any sense to me, right? But Ursula K Le Guin, that's who we're talking about. I think she's the best, and she's the one who unlocked reading science fiction being good to me. Now, I wanted to put this photo of her because often you'll see the photos of her when she's elderly, which is fine. I think she's really wonderful, but I really don't think that we think about some of these authors who I only saw Le Guin in interviews and stuff like that when she was older, but she was younger, right? And one of the quotes that will always stick with me is this book is from her book called Lathe of Heaven, which is kind of an interesting novel about a person whose dreams affect reality. And his therapist realizes this and starts to try to manipulate this person. It's an interesting book, but here's a quote from it: "The end justifies the means, but what if there never is an end? All we have is the means." And so look, that's 3 short sentences, plain language, right? But what a fucking idea that it asked you to consider. You know, it's a warning against like utopian thought in the sense that if really all you're trying to do is bring about the end and you don't pay attention to the means that you get there, you can start doing really monstrous stuff. Because Le Guin says, what if you never see the end, or what if you never accomplish it? All you have is the means. So you have to pay attention to the way that you get to your goal. So I think Le Guin is one of those people who's not satisfied with easy answers, right? She understands that we do need the visions of the end, of the stuff of the utopia, what we're trying to get at. But she never leaves behind the idea that a lot of horribly monstrous things in history have happened because people forget the means. And they often feel justified in doing really horrible things because of the end that they're seeking. And guess what? We haven't reached utopia. So all of those monstrous things actually never amounted to the good things. So the end didn't happen. And all we have is the shitty things that happen in history, right? So 3 short sentences, plain speech. But man, I think it hits like a hammer, and I think it's really great. And this is why I love Le Guin. I love Le Guin. Total fan of her and her writing. Okay. What is your favorite science fiction horror or favorite science fiction movie? I had to think a lot about this. I mean, there's been a lot of really great science fiction in the past decade or so. I should have put The Day the Earth Stood Still. I thought about it, but I forgot. I could rewatch that movie all the time. The Day the Earth Stood Still, the original one, black and white, really quiet, slow-paced movie. I really love it. And I really love it because it's an alien who comes to Earth, and he's just trying to communicate and get humans to be good, but humans really mess it up, and they even are aggressive toward him. And then there's like this interesting speech at the end of that particular movie where he's talking about how these robots or other types of civilizations basically had to force them, this advanced alien species, into cooperation. Or else they wouldn't have done it. And so he was kind of doing the same thing to Earth a little bit. But it was clear that Earth wasn't ready. I love that movie so much. So Day the Earth Stood Still, the original black and white one, highly recommended. Then there's other ones like Arrival that's based on a Chiang story. I actually like the movie way more than I like the short story. That's another really great one that I could have put on here. But I've chosen 2 that I've rewatched, multiple times, and they always hold up for me. One is Her, and it's a 2013 movie directed by Spike Jonze. I think it's a beautifully shot movie, but the entire premise is that there's these AI sort of assistants like we have in all of our homes and on our phones now that are pretty advanced, self-aware, helpful. They have their own personalities, etc. And it follows the main character there, played by Joaquin Phoenix, and he and this AI sort of like start to develop a relationship. And so the movie basically considers, what does it mean for you to love someone, right? What are the limits, or what are the things that make us human? Is there something like love that can transcend species? I don't. I think it's a really good movie. It's slow, okay? It's slow, but I think it's very well done in what it's trying to do. I love this one. I think it's what science fiction can do. It takes a really strong premise, completely sentient, sapient AI, and it takes this man who's kind of like a sensitive soul, and it just lets the story happen from there, right? I think it's really, really excellent. And this one, I love horror movies. I love horror movies. My favorite horror movie of all time, Nightmare on Elm Street. Okay, probably shortly after that, a movie that I watch very frequently, especially when it gets cold or if it's snowy, 30 Days of Night. Not too far from those is The Fly. So this is a remake, 1986, because there was an older original one, but it was remade by David Croenenberg. And David Croenenberg is a master of body horror and just creepy stuff, and he does this excellently in this fucking movie. And he has Jeff Goldblum, who's so likable in this movie, and then you just watch him slowly transform. This movie is incredible. Again, it's based on a science fiction premise, basically a mishap, and I think this one is excellent. So Her and The Fly are movies that I've watched, like I said, multiple times, and I think that they stand up. They stand up. Okay. What is your favorite science fiction TV show? This is easy for me. It's really easy for me. Star Trek, all the way. I could have put Jean-Luc Picard up here because that would have been immediately identifiable. He's my favorite Star Trek captain by far. All right. I just like that he is a great leader. I like that he lets himself experience certain things, but for the most part, he is bound by duty and very smart, self-sacrificial. Just a good fucking character. I love Picard so much. But my favorite characters of all time might be Guinan, so the person who's played by Whoopi Goldberg. I really love her. I love that her species is kind of ancient. She's this bartender on the Enterprise. She's a counselor, but she'll throw down, man. I love Guinan so much. But my favorite character, I think, is slowly becoming Dr. Phlox, who this picture is right here. Dr. Phlox is an alien. He's one of the few aliens on this in Star Trek Enterprise. It's a different Star Trek, and he's a doctor, and I love him. He's lighthearted, but he's not afraid of going into the icky stuff. He's not afraid of going into like the dark recesses of his own mind and other people's minds. Love Dr. Phlox. He's like absolutely one of my favorite characters in all of Star Trek, but maybe my favorite character overall. Now, Star Trek is huge, okay? And there are problems in pretty much every single series. I don't know that I've ever watched a Star Trek series that I don't have problems with. I don't like, for example, the original series almost at all. I think it's kind of beautiful. It's shot a little bit like a stage play, so the colors are gorgeous. But I just find a lot of the premises really cheesy, and I really hate Captain Kirk. And Voyager. Voyager is just really bleak. Don't really like that too much. There aren't too many characters that I find really all that memorable or all that great. So I tend to rewatch the most The Next Generation. I really love that The Next Generation, which has Captain Picard, has these compelling characters, and it's mostly episodic, so you can just watch each episode and they stand alone. I think that's my favorite. Deep Space Nine is often the one that's taken as the best one, because it's dramatic and it develops like a storyline that goes throughout the seasons. The last season of Deep Space Nine, if you can make it through everything to get there, is just full of really powerful, resolution. it's a fantastic series, but you have to get through so many seasons to reach that resolution. So if you don't have that much time and you somehow have access to Star Trek, I've given you 3 episodes here that I think everyone could enjoy. Okay? The first one is The Next Generation. It's called A Matter of Honor. And what this episode is about, season 2, episode 8 in The Next Generation, is about Commander Riker, a human, who decides to basically do this kind of like exchange program where he is an officer aboard a Klingon spaceship. I think it's really great in trying to talk about the different things that might happen if you interact with an alien species, and exchange culture and stuff like that. It has a great plot. It's really action driven, and yeah, I just think it's really wonderful. A Matter of Honor, that's in The Next Generation, season 2, episode 8. The second one, and this is like totally one of my favorites. This is from Star Trek Enterprise, season 1, episode 5. And this is what made me basically like stick with Star Trek Enterprise, which I think is a great series. But it has its low points as far as like not being that great. But this episode single-handedly, I think, made me buy into the entire series. It's called Unexpected. And I don't want to say too much about it, but I will say that it happens whenever an alien, because Enterprise, the entire drama is this is the first time that Earth has been able to send a faster than light speed vessel out into space. Okay? And so for the first time, Earth people meet another alien species, and they decide to, talk. And the engineer from the Earth ship goes to the other alien ship, and there's an exchange that kind of results in a pregnancy. I guess I'll say that. And it's not clear what happened because they're alien, right? No one knows what the biological interaction is going to be like. Earthlings are new in this part of the solar system or the galaxy, right? And I think it's just so good, so good. So that's Unexpected, Star Trek Enterprise, season 1, episode 5. And then the other one that I'll give, and this is from Deep Space Nine. Deep Space Nine isn't really episodic. It has a lot of stuff where you have to understand the trajectory of most of the plot. I think that can make the narrative more moving, but I think that can also be a hindrance in a lot of ways because you have to like watch so much to really understand what's going on. That said, there are exceptions. And I think that the Ferengi, which are like the big-eared, they're basically a satire of Earth people because they're really, really ruthless capitalists. But they have a lot of single episodes that I think are great. There's one called Little Green Men, which is excellent. There's kind of like this weird time thing, and the Ferengi end up in Earth during like the 1950s. So good. I would recommend that one. But I really like the Magnificent Ferengi. So the Ferengi, unlike humans, because often you see Starfleet, these people who went through quasi-military training and are the best of the best, unlike the Klingon soldiers, unlike, the Trill soldiers or whoever else that you see in Deep Space Nine, the Ferengi in Deep Space Nine are mostly normal people. Normal people full of flaws, normal people not really that capable of really extraordinary things. They lose their cool a lot. They don't know how to handle stuff. That said, the Magnificent Ferengi is basically about one of the Ferengi, one of these aliens. A enemy force takes one of their loved ones hostage, and they have to figure out how to rescue their loved one. Like I said, they're pretty average people, average people, even though they're a different alien. And it's funny, it's great. It's kind of like a heist episode, but with like these flawed characters, and I just think it's really funny and very, very well done. So that's the Magnificent Ferengi, season 6, episode 10. Highly recommend those 3 things if you want to get into Star Trek. Maybe you don't like Star Trek, but even if you don't like Star Trek, those 3 episodes would not be a waste of your time. Okay. Next question. What science fiction book do you feel should be read more often? Okay, so for me, as I said, she was coming back. The word for world is forest, and I put a picture up there in the slides as well. This is a short book. Okay, it's a short book. It's a little bit cliche. It's basically a story about Earth and they travel, and Earthlings find a planet, and the planet is full of forest. And what do the Earthlings want to do? They want to exploit the natural resources to make money. Okay, uh, so so that's the plot. You can kind of guess where it's going from there. It gets complicated because the Earthlings meet an alien species that live on that planet. What I think Le Guin is such a master of is this is written from the first person perspective of multiple characters. And she really gets into the mind of all of the characters and doesn't shy away from the weaknesses and the strengths of every single character. It's often hard to find weaknesses in your heroes. It's often hard to find strengths in the villains. But Le Guin can do both, and she does both very well. It's elegant, it's good, it's short. I think if you want to see if you like Le Guin and kind of what she's about, this is a great place to start. I would highly recommend this book to anyone. The word for world is forest. Check it out. Okay. What is your favorite science fiction short story? Now, this is my domain. I love short stories. I think the writing in short stories to me is much more impactful than the writing in novels. Why? Because in a short story, you don't have space. You really have to be all killer, no filler. You have to get down to the point. You have to have a strong premise that's going to carry you through the story. And if it ends up sucking, no big deal. You just spent maybe an hour or two reading it as opposed to, 12 hours or whatever, or a few weeks of your free time reading a novel, right? I think short stories for me are that's what I love. And I could have put so many people on here. Obviously, Ursula K Le Guin, who I mentioned, is a short story writer. You can totally find her collections. Birthday of the World is a great place to start if you want to check some of her stuff out. But I've chosen one particular short story that I can't get out of my head ever. And it is this one. Spar by Kij Johnson. She's an incredible writer. And I've assigned this short story to like a few of my classes, especially on sexuality. And this story is so good. You can find it for free on the Clarkesworld website, which is one of the best magazines in science fiction. It's probably my favorite magazine. They treat their writers very well. It's very tough to get published in Clarkesworld. Clarkesworld is wonderful, okay? Johnson published there, which is a huge feat in its own. And then this story won a ton of awards. It won the Nebula and the Hugo, which are kind of the big ones, and the Locust, which is also a big one. And I'll just read the first line, which I've put in the screenshot here. In the tiny lifeboat, she and the alien fuck endlessly, relentlessly. It's a good first line, right? Short stories, you don't have the time to waste. You are in the middle of the action, you get to the point. And Johnson does a great job of that. Now, this is a story basically about a human woman who gets put in a lifeboat with this like amoeba type alien. And they have this weird interaction that is basically like sex, but it's not clear. It's not clear because the amoeba isn't humanoid at all. And it doesn't use language at all. And so the human woman doesn't really know how to communicate. And I think that this short story is an excellent way of trying to figure out what it would be like to have contact with an alien that isn't actually like a human. So Star Trek, you have to use humans because you have to use actors, and it helps with the politics and some of the narrative, right? But in really like innovative science fiction, you deal with aliens that are truly alien. And I think that Spar does that. It's a very short story. It's a weird story about sex and intimacy and communication and whether we can talk with people or things that are fundamentally different than us. I think there's like maybe a little bit of redemption or becoming your true self at the very end. I think that this story is full of different ways that you can interpret it, and it's just fantastic. So the best science fiction short story I've ever read is probably Kij Johnson's Spar. Despite the fact that I've read a ton of them, this one sticks with me and it holds up whenever I talk about it with people and whenever, I think about it. It's just an excellent story. Highly recommend it. Okay. And what is your favorite science fiction book? Now, this was hard. This was really hard. Like I said, there's a lot of science fiction books that I think get a ton of acclaim that I absolutely hate. Dune, for example. I think Frank Herbert is a terrible writer. I think he gets lost in the sauce, man. He talks so much about his world building and like these weird religions and philosophies. And even though people will say it's not a white savior story, because Paul Atreides, spoiler alert, doesn't end up being the savior, and the whole series is kind of like a thought on like what happens and the bad things that happen whenever you trust charismatic leaders, right? I feel like the books are way too long. Herbert is way too self-important with the way that he talks about the religions and the politics and the society, and the pace of them is just way too slow. I could talk about so many other things. One book, for example, that is really, really popular is A Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. The last couple chapters of this book are a meditation on what utopia is, and if utopia means that we get rid of human flaws, are we okay with that? And I love that. That said, I think the pacing of this book really suffers, and I don't think it's that well written. So there's like a lot of books that get a ton of love that I don't like. 1984 is another great example. So I thought about, for example, The Star Is My Destination by Alfred Bester. That's a novel basically about a man who learns how to teleport. And teleportation also, a lot of people learn it, and it changes society a lot. It's a revenge story. I think it's excellent. I really dig that story. Another one that I happen to have as well is The Forever War by Joe Haldeman. I think this one holds up as well. Another short novel. And it's basically a story about these excellent soldiers who have to go and fight this like interstellar war, but they have to travel at 80% the speed of light, which does some weird things to time. Basically, time passes normal for them, but it passes quickly from their perspective on Earth. So they return to an Earth that is fundamentally different than the one that they left. By the time they get back, all of the people that they knew in their middle ages have either died or are very, very old. So it's kind of like, it's very literally talking about soldiers not being able to come home, right? You can't go back to the home that you left because everything is fundamentally different. And I think it's very interesting because the soldiers keep signing up for the war because they can't really go back home. Again, interesting things about PTSD, war, all that kind of stuff. So Joe Haldeman, I love The Forever War. So Alfred Bester, The Star Is My Destination. Joe Haldeman, The Forever War are probably kind of like my honorable mentions. But I'm going to go with this one. And this is a weird one because this is typically taken as horror. But the main character in I Am Legend is a man who uses science to try and help his life along. This is a post-apocalyptic horror movie. It's the one that inspired all of the movies, if you saw the Will Smith one or whatever. But for whatever it is, the book is so much better. It's so much better. I think that it's a little bit slow in the middle. So sometimes there is a tiny slog, but it's a short book, so you can get through it pretty easily. I think that I Am Legend, because I've reread this one multiple times. This is one of those ones in the fall, right? I start getting in the spirit of Halloween and all that kind of stuff. This is one that I always return to because it's short and I think it's excellent. And it makes even more sense now that we've been through the COVID pandemic and being in lockdown. Because basically, this novel, for the most part, is just one man. He has no one else. He has a world that is utterly violent to him, and he has to do what he can to survive. And I think it's great. I think this one just holds up. I don't know if it's science fiction in the strictest sense, but I'm going to count it because he tries to find a cure to a disease that's kind of happened, and he's often trying to rig together scientific stuff to get the world to work in certain ways. Maybe it's better post-apocalyptic horror, but I'm gonna count it in sci-fi. I gave you science fiction in the honorable mentions anyway. So yeah, that's it. Thank you so much for making through this. I think I've been talking for close to an hour. I want to thank Plagued by Visions for calling this hashtag to me. And I want to thank the original creator for these interesting questions. And so for the people who are always asking me about science fiction and stuff that I like to read in fiction, now you have a little bit of background. I'm always down to give recommendations, but I'm a picky person with odd tastes. as you've probably seen in some of my heretical statements. So thank you so much for your attention. And as always, I just want to say I love you. Thank you for spending your time watching this. Please take some time to love yourselves, and maybe I'll see you next time.